In this video, we'll show how you can run Xbasic code asynchronously on the server. So normally when you make an Ajax callback in a UX or a grid component, the Ajax callback executes Xbasic code on the server, and it's common to lock the screen while the Xbasic code is executing and then unlock the screen when the Xbasic code finishes and the Ajax callbacks sends a response back to the client. But if you have long-running Xbasic code, so maybe some code that might run for a couple of minutes, then what you'd like to do is run that code in an asynchronous way so that the user can continue working on other projects or other tasks in their component. So in this example over here, when I press this button to run asynchronous Xbasic, we're going to run Xbasic code that generates about 15 different reports and then uploads those reports to an S3 bucket. So the S3 bucket where we're going to be uploading is this temporary demo bucket, which you can see currently is empty. So now what I'm going to do is press this button, which is going to make an Ajax callback and register the Xbasic code that needs to be run asynchronously. And when I press this button, I'm going to get back a job ID, and the job ID is something that I can use to periodically query the status of my job. So I'll go ahead here and say run Xbasic asynchronously, and you'll see that we get back our job ID, and then we can go now and we can ask for our job status. So our job status right now is that we're currently printing report number 3 of 21. And if we start looking in the bucket here, we see that there's a bunch of reports that have already been printed. We don't have all 21 yet. So if I go and check the status now, now we're done, it looks like. So now we're printing 15 of 21. So if we go back now and look at our bucket here, we can see that basically that we're continuing to print reports, and if I go and get my job status now, we're currently now completed. So let's fire this off again and show that while this Xbasic code is running asynchronously, we can continue to do other things in our component. So I'm going to go here and delete all of these files right now, these reports. So now this bucket is empty again, and then we'll kick off our asynchronous job again. So that's going to give us a new job ID, which we can use to query the status. And now I can go and do other things, like, for example, open a grid component. So there we've opened a grid component. And while this is open, if we go and look now in our S3 bucket, we'll see that here that there are reports that are still being generated. So right now, the last report that was generated was Finland, I think. So we'll go there. Now we've got a whole bunch of additional reports. So what we've seen here is that the Xbasic code is running in the background asynchronously, and we can continue to work on other things in our component. So let's take a look now how this was all set up in the first place. So we go back now to design mode. So we're continuing now with our discussion of running Xbasic asynchronously in an Ajax callback. And we're going to take a look now at how this UX component was set up. So when we click this button over here, we're making an Ajax callback to the server, and we're registering some Xbasic code that we would like to run asynchronously. So let's go take a look at this button. So we can see here that this button is making an Ajax callback to a function called XB. So let's go take a look now at XB. So here's our function XB, and you can see that we're defining over here the base URL. So this is the URL of the website where the Xbasic code will be run asynchronously. So in this case, we're going to be running this Xbasic code in this website over here, which is where the report that we want to print has been published. So this URL here, this is the base URL. This URL must be publicly accessible. So then here we can see from line 7 onwards is where we actually define the Xbasic code that we want to run. So let's go take a look now at this Xbasic code. So from line 7 to 85 is the Xbasic code that runs asynchronously. So if we look at this code, what we do is we're first of all we're setting an error handler saying if there is an error, then jump to the code at the label failed. Then we're saying the name of the report that we want to run is called RDS customers.a5rpt. So this is a report that we created in our web project, and then we publish this report to this website. Then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to make an entry in the repository table specifying that the job has been registered. So the repository table, basically we specify the name of the job ID over here. So this is underbar GUID. And when the Xbasic code that is run, it has access to this variable. So this is a special variable that contains the job ID. So as you recall, when we ran this component in the first place, and we clicked this this button to register code, we got back from our Ajax callback a job ID. So I'll go there, click that, and you can see there's my job ID. So this GUID represents my job ID, and then I can use this job ID during the course of the code, the Xbasic code, to update the job status so that at any point in time I can go here and get the job status. So you can see there's my current job status, printing 11 of 21. So if we go back to design mode here, we can see that we're saving a status message that says the job has been registered using this job ID. And the web repository is specified by going to web projects, going to project settings, and then scrolling down in project settings to repository settings here, and specifying the connection string to your SQL database, and then the name of the table that where the repository information will be stored. So we've set up the repository, and that means that we can now write to the repository during the course of the code running. So let's go back to our component over here. So we can see here that we are going to be, we put a message in the repository saying that the job has been registered. So at this point, the reports haven't actually started printing yet. Then we have this JSON string here that contains the names of all of the countries. So these are the countries for which we're going to be printing the report. Then we go here and we pass the JSON to get an array. We get the size of the array. So this is this count here is the number of countries in this JSON array over here. And then we basically start looping over this array. So we're going to print the report for each country. So we just put in a sleep here. We don't really need the sleep, but I've just put it in to slow things down so that it takes a little bit of time for this Xbasic code to run asynchronously. And then we put another message which says we're currently printing report number I of count, and then we specify what the country name is. So as you recall, every time we press the status, the update status button, we got a message back that said, printing report 3 of 21 or 5 of 21, etc. And then we write that message to the repository. So here's where the real work starts to get to be done. So we now basically create an object with a filter property, and then we get a temporary PDF file name, and then we call the A5W report save as function to print the report and save it into a PDF file. So we're saving it into a temporary PDF file, and then if that file exists, then we take the binary data from that file and we save it to this S3 bucket. So CS local is the connection string to the bucket where we want to store our report. So if we go up to the top of the file here, we can see that our connection string CS local is this connection string which points to that bucket where we want to save all of the reports. So here we go. So this is the function the Xbasic function that saves binary data in an S3 bucket, and we give it an object name that's derived over here. So the object name is report underbar and then the name of the country. So this is going to basically give us the report in the S3 bucket. If the file doesn't exist, which means that there was an error generating this report, then we create another object that says failed and then underbar country. And then once this loop completes, then we've printed all the reports. We put another message into the repository saying completed, and that's the end of our script. And then you can see here that this is our error handler. So if there was any error, we set our error handler at the top here to say if there's any error, then jump to this label. So here's the label failed, and then if there is an error, then we put a message in the repository that says that there was an error on, and we get the error text and then the error line over there. Then we call this Xbasic function here to register this code to run asynchronously, and we also pass in both the Xbasic code to run and also the URL. And this function returns the GUID, which is the job ID. So we take this GUID and we store it in the client side in a variable called underbar job ID. And this is important because we need to know what this GUID is so that we can make periodic callbacks to the server to find out what the status is of the job. And just so we can see what that GUID is, we're actually going to print it out into the inner HTML of div 0. So if we go here to controls, we see that we have a static text control there. And we have inside the static text control, we have a div with an ID of div 0. So that's going to show us what the job ID is. And then from time to time, we can go here and we can press this button, which makes another Ajax callback, calling a function called xb2. But when we make this callback, we pass back as part of the callback data the job ID. So you can see here we're saying job ID is equal to dialog.object.underbar job ID, because that's where we stored the job ID when we registered the Xbasic code that we wanted to run. And then we basically pass that job ID back as the additional data in the Ajax callback. So if we go look now at xb2, we can see that what xb2 does is it takes the job ID that was passed back, and then it basically makes a call to this function to get the status from the repository, and then it writes that status back to the inner HTML of div number 1. So what we've seen in this video here is how the Xbasic code that runs asynchronously gets registered or gets defined, and how it's invoked. So thank you very much for watching.